This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
Thank you very much, Aryadasa, for that very, very, very generous introduction. So you have a series going on at the moment called Tantra Now. And I noticed that the topic for this evening is Padmavajra. And it says my name and then it says Padmavajra. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about myself. I must admit, talking about Tantric Buddhism is very difficult. Talking about the Dharma is very difficult. But talking about Tantric Dharma is particularly difficult because it is a very unusual expression of Buddhism. I think it sort of starts to emerge 4th, 5th, 6th century, maybe a bit later than that, in India. Last week, I haven't heard the talk, but Vedanya gave an absolutely barnstorming talk. So in a way, I don't have to reiterate all that. I think he was invoking magic and sorcerers and all that sort of thing. So I don't have to do that. But it is a difficult thing to talk about. But in a way, Vedanya's made it easier for me to give you a sort of feeling for the spirit of Tantric Buddhism. He's made it easier for me with his Dharna appeal. I really appreciated Vedanya's Dharna appeal, his evocation of the Dharna economy at the beginning. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you for money. But it put me in mind of something. Something that Sangharakshita, our teacher and the founder of our order, mentioned. And he talked in one place about one of the times he was about to take what they call tantric initiation. Tantric initiation is really important. You have a teacher, a guru, a Vajracharya, a Vajra teacher, and he or she, sometimes there are women teachers, they introduce you to a particular meditation practice or even cycle of practices through a ritual introduction to the meditation on a particular Buddha or Bodhisattva. And he was told by his friends that he was going to be initiated by one of the greatest lamas, Tibetan gurus of the last century, the great Jamyang Khyentse Rinpoche. And he was not just going to receive one initiation, he was going to receive 4 in one, with the Bodhisattva of Wisdom, Manjushri, as the main figure. And he was told, he was advised, his Tibetan friends and another teacher were advising him how you approach something like this. This is, very, a great, to be given an initiation by this teacher, but to be given 4 in one was a great gift. He was advised, it's expected in this tradition that you make a cash donation. You make a cash donation. Money, luka, rupees. And this was a surprise to Bhante, to Sangharakshita, because in the other traditions he'd been in, there was no sort of request for that. Yes, there's the culture of dharna, but you go to the Dharma teacher and you hear the Dharma. But no, it's expected that there's a cash donation. No amount was specified. He didn't say to his friend, well, how much? They didn't say how much. And he said, well, I had hardly any money. So he had to go through in his mind, well, how much do I value what I'm going to be given? How much do I really value it? Should I just give all the rupees that I've got and not worry for tomorrow? He didn't say what he did, but it said it's very interesting what goes through your mind. And of course, the Tantra, or the Vajrayana, as it's sometimes called, the way of the thunderbolt, what they're saying is, with a point like this, look, This meditation practice, this Dharma, this teaching is the quick way to liberation. This is going to accelerate your spiritual development. I mean, they even talk about enlightenment in one lifetime in the Vajrayana. How much do you value that? What are you prepared to give for that? What's enough? What's enough? So, listening to Vedanya, that came to my mind, how interesting that is. And it definitely isn't a payment. It's definitely not a consumer situation, because no, it might just be you give just 1 rupee. For some person, that might be all their wealth. But you give yourself as fully as possible. And if we want to understand the spirit of Tantric Buddhism, really understand what it means to follow Tantric Buddhism, and in fact, not just Tantric Buddhism, but the whole of Buddhism, all Buddhist practice, you have to be prepared to give absolutely everything. Absolutely everything. This can come as a bit of a shock. I mean, sometimes people take up Buddhist practice and it's something to sort of fit in to their life. And that's fair enough, when you're starting off. Everybody needs to benefit. You bring it in. But if you're serious, if you really want to follow the path to enlightenment, it is going to take all of you. There are tantric prayers where you're praying to your teacher, you're praying to your meditational deity, where you say things like that. I offer myself to you completely. I offer to you my heart, my chest, my lungs, my eyes, my ears, everything. You even have special tantric offerings which are a bit strong, like your heart, your brain, your entrails, incense of singed flesh. I mean, it's not literally. Don't take it. Don't do this at home, folks. But it's this spirit of completely giving yourself to the practice. This can be a bit, hard for us to take, but it is actually true. I've sometimes had the experience of somebody coming to me and saying, "Well, I want to take up meditation and Buddhist practice, but I don't really want it to affect my life. I like my life the way it is, but I'm interested in Buddhism, and so I'd like to, learn a bit of meditation and do a bit of study of Buddhism, but I don't want it to really affect anything." And I said, "Well, I really can't help you. If I gave, if I started to teach you these things, I can't guarantee it won't do that to you. It won't change you, completely. And then you'll be upset with me. So you really do need to think again." So this is very much the spirit of Tantric Buddhism. And of course, who you give to, because it is going to be a person, is the teacher. This is the first thing I really want to talk about, or the second thing. The first thing really is this spirit of giving oneself completely to Buddhist practice. Perhaps when we have the groups later, that might be a discussion point for you. How much am I giving to my practice? How much am I prioritizing meditation? How much am I prioritizing study? And so on and so forth. It would be worth, investigating that, looking at that, just quite honestly, how far am I prepared to go? But in the Tantric tradition, the person you give to typically is the guru, the teacher. This can sound a bit, this can make us all feel very uneasy, because it can sound a bit cultish, can't it? The great guru that you give everything to and you become brainwashed and all the rest of it. That isn't really what the spirit of Tantric Buddhism is about. This is quite hard for us to understand. In a way, we're not ready yet for Tantric Buddhism in the West. In some ways, we're not ready for Buddhism. We're still working on creating the conditions for Buddhism, full Buddhism, if you like, because it requires a quality of reverence, faith, and devotion, which is very, very rare It's very, very rare in the modern world. Us moderns in the West are profoundly democratic and egalitarian. That's not just a political system. It's also, we're psychologically profoundly egalitarian and democratic. I'm not criticizing that, but I think we need to acknowledge that. But the tantric tradition, Buddhist tradition, comes out of a culture, I've got to use a really dirty word, which is profoundly hierarchical. Profoundly hierarchical. I don't mean a power hierarchy. I don't mean that at all. I mean a hierarchy of love, a hierarchy of value. It's interesting, the word hierarchy in the West was coined by somebody called Dionysius the Areopagite, or pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. He probably wasn't Dionysius the Areopagite. It's probably a Syrian Christian Neoplatonist monk. And his notion of hierarchy was that the divine is in relationship to us now. The divine is in relationship to us. It's not over there oppressing us. We participate in the divine. That enables us to grow and develop along the path. And this is very, very much the Buddhist vision, the tantric vision. We participate in higher states of consciousness already. And we see that particularly embodied in the teacher. That would be the Vajrayana position. They even go so far as to say that your teacher, your guru, your true spiritual friend is the Buddha. He or she is the Buddha for you. It's not saying that they're fully and perfectly enlightened, but they're the most enlightened person that you could possibly meet. This is one of the great features of Tantric Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism. They want to know where reality is, where the Buddha is, where the Dharma is, where the Sangha is in our actual experience here and now. And they say, well, Buddha Shakyamuni entered parinirvana so many centuries ago. No, you haven't met him. Nobody's met him. The great archetypal Buddhas, Amitabha and so on, well, they're off in their Pure Lands. You don't see them. Where is enlightenment in your experience? In a person, and there is only enlightened people. There's no such thing as enlightenment. There's only enlightened people. Enlightenment's an abstraction. So where in your experience is enlightenment? The enlightened person. It's in your teacher. It's in your teacher. Now, this isn't something to be insisted upon. You can go on websites these days, of say, Tibetan gurus, and they'll tell you who the Lama is, the incarnation of this, that, and the other, and Avalokiteshvara. That tells you nothing. That tells you nothing. It comes out of your actual living experience of knowing someone over time, and realizing that, yes, they are more developed than me, and I can really learn from them. I can learn how to live the Dharma right now, because that's what a teacher really does. A teacher is someone who very, very skillfully knows you very well and can apply the Buddha's teachings right here and now to your experience. So, of course, this is why you want to offer everything to the teacher. You want to give all you can to the teacher, because they bring the Dharma right into your heart here and now. And it has to be said, yes, there'll be meditation instruction, there'll be all those things coming from a teacher, and so on and so forth. But in a way, that isn't quite enough. What the Vajrayana teacher does, the Tantric teacher does, is confront you with reality. Confront you with yourself in relation to reality. They use this word Vajraguru. Vajraguru. Vajra means adamantine. It means unbreakable, indestructible. It's a thunderbolt. And it crashes through. So the Vajraguru, Sangharakshita says, is the no-nonsense guru. The no-nonsense guru, the no-nonsense teacher. The Vajrayana guru, he says, doesn't care what he does to wake the disciple up to reality. He's not interested in your feelings, not interested in your reactions. There's just this immediate confrontation with reality. So I think in some ways the guru for us isn't going to be one person, probably. It's more like a principle that you find in your life, in your experience. If you're sufficiently open, if you're sufficiently devoted, there will be times in your life where the guru will be present in some way. You have to kind of watch out for them. Although sometimes it might well be associated with a person. So my own teacher, Sangharakshita, although he sort of rejected the notion of guru. He thought that was, it was such a degraded, corrupted word. He didn't much like it. But I have to admit, there have been times in my life, and I knew him from the age of 17, where I was definitely confronted by reality, by my reality, through my encounters with him. So the first time I met Sangharakshita, very, very early on in a tiny room in a terraced house in Brighton, the first Buddhist centre we had in Brighton, I was sitting alone in a room with Sangharakshita, and these photographs we have of Sangharakshita, he looks quite sort of grandfatherly. In those days he really didn't look like that. We're talking about 1974. He had long greasy hair down to his shoulders. He had these weird sort of bent glasses. His teeth weren't too good. They really weren't too good. And he dressed, well, quite roughly, a kind of rough kind of jacket, kind of tweed jacket, and, a rather holey a jumper with holes. And he used to wear these great big boots as well, sort of working men's boots. So he quite a strange figure, usually a bit unshaven, and quite strange to be around. You didn't necessarily felt put at your ease. Very authentic, very much himself. Not even thinking about being himself. And I was sitting in this room with him. I was 17. And I was sitting there, we were drinking tea, and he definitely wasn't putting me at my ease. He was just sitting, looking into space. And I was looking at him, looking into space, in complete silence. He'd come to the centre to dedicate the centre and so on, and to see people. There he was, just looking into space, and I'm looking at him, feeling really uncomfortable, not knowing what to say, feeling really kind of self-conscious and weird, as you would at 17. When you're with, somebody who looks like that and who's a lot older, and you've heard all his lectures and all that, and you think he's your teacher, but it's all going a bit weird. So we're sitting there, and he leant over to the mantelpiece above the fire, and he took out an incense stick from a jar and proceeded to clean his ears, which isn't a very aesthetic experience. But what was very interesting for me was the thought that went through my mind was, what would my mum say? What would my mum say? And it wasn't like, it's a teaching. It was, what would my mum say? There was a kind of confrontation. I learnt, by the way, when I went to India, that's quite a common sight. People do clean their ears in India in public. They're quite unself-conscious about it. But it was a real shock. It was a real shock to me. I still don't really know what the teaching was. I'm still trying to work it out. But it was just, there was no, how can I put it? There was no airs and graces. There was just something about it that sort of communicated something quite powerfully to me. Another time was in India. I talked about this on Sunday. I was in India when Sangharakshita returned to India. Was giving lots of talks, and it was a wonderfully devotional time, very inspiring time. And we'd come back from these wonderful lectures given to thousands of people, with all these wonderful garlands, and the atmosphere was so uplifting, and I was so moved. And I was Sangharakshita's attendant at that time, and I went into his room to put up his mosquito net and to make sure he was all right. And I wanted to express my feelings of gratitude and wonder at being with him. And I said, Bhante, I don't know what I'll do when you die. This is just so wonderful. And he turned to me and looked me in the eye, quick as a flash, and said, well, that's assuming that I'll die first. And it was a real Vajra, really confronting me with my mortality. So this is what the teacher does. This is what the teacher does. This is what the tantric teacher does. This is what any teacher does, really. They confront you with reality. I mean, there's all sorts of other interactions I've had with Sangharakshita over the years. I can't go into all of them, but one of the things that was a very, very strong message to me was, and this is very tantric, was the need for me to take responsibility for my life. Again and again and yet again, he kept throwing me back on myself. And of course, tomorrow we mark the anniversary of the first year of his passing. He died a year ago tomorrow. And I must admit, I felt when he died, this is your sort of final teaching to me, isn't it? That it really is, you're on your own. Yes, you have a Sangha, a wonderful Sangha, but it's up to you now. I'm not here. It's over to you. You need to make progress in your life. It's sometimes said the highest teaching of the Vajrayana Guru is to leave the disciple, is to throw you back on yourself. So this is, tremendously important. So perhaps you could think and reflect on, it might not be that there's one person like that in your life. Those times, those moments when you've been confronted with reality very, very starkly, perhaps confronted with your mortality, perhaps confronted with your conditioning, like I was, what would Mum say? Where you've been brought up against your very conventional way of thinking, where you've been confronted with a situation where you have to take responsibility for what's going on. You have to take responsibility for your development. That's a very kind of tantric Buddhist way of looking at things. That's the teacher principle. So that's the first thing. I said when I started that when Sangharakshita went to, when he went to take initiation, he was instructed, a cash donation is expected. And of course, what he was initiated into was a meditation on a particular form of enlightenment. In Buddhist tradition, especially Tantric Buddhism, enlightenment is personified. Enlightenment is a person, an archetypal person of great beauty and colour, with tremendous sort of symbolic associations. And it's said, this is called in Indian Buddhism, this is called the Ishtadevata, the greatly desired deity. In Tibetan Buddhism, it's called the Yidam, the oath-bound figure, the oath-bound deity, because you make a sort of pact or bond with this figure. And this is very hard, perhaps, for people to understand. Why is this important? Why is this so central? And you're instructed, you're taught how to meditate on a Buddha or Bodhisattva, and you do that for the rest of your life. You do that daily for the rest of your life. That becomes the centre of your spiritual practice. And of course, we have this in our own order. And, Sangharakshita, when he ordained me, he initiated me into a mantra and taught me a meditation on a particular Buddha or Bodhisattva, which has been the centre of my spiritual practice ever since. I do this practice every morning. I meditate on enlightenment on this form every morning. And the Tantric tradition says this is the Dharma refuge in your experience. So the Guru is the Buddha refuge in your experience. The Buddha or Bodhisattva that you regularly meditate on is the Dharma refuge in your experience. So this, we need to go into this again. What does this mean? Well, the Vajrayana people, the Tantric people say, well, the Dharma is made up of 84,000 heaps. There's 84,000 Dharma Skandakas. There's that many teachings. You're never going to know them all. You're never going to know them all. You're not going to understand them all. And how much experience do you actually have of this Dharma? You know, how much is it alive for you? So how do you make it real? How do you make it live in your experience? You have to find what you have a powerful emotional response to. This is what these Buddha and Bodhisattva figures represent. It's the Dharma that you have a powerful attraction to. This is really important. One of the main problems in Insight of Sangharakshita's, the central problem for most people, all people, in the spiritual life is to find emotional equivalence to intellectual understanding. It's a tremendous insight. Emotional equivalence to intellectual understanding. We know everything. We know everything. We know we should love everybody. We know that we should be a good person. We know, we know everything we need to know to get enlightened. Of course we do. You just read a few books and you know enough. Do we do it? No, we don't. Because emotionally, we're just not there. Our emotions need to move. They need to shift. And they need to be attracted. This is the point. You need to find that which you love in the Dharma, that you really love. Not just like a bit, not that you're just a bit infatuated with, but you are absolutely burning with love about. You have to find that in the Dharma that is absolutely beautiful. Not just beautiful, but absolutely fascinating, magnetic, beguiling. You know, like in the Sufi tradition, they talk about the lover, which is the practitioner, being like a moth that just cannot stay away from that candle flame. You know, that just, you watch moths just fluttering around that candle flame and then incineration. And in Sufi tradition they say, well, that's fana, that's annihilation in reality. A bit drastic, isn't it? But that's the same sort of idea. You have to find in the Dharma that which is powerfully attractive, that which fascinates you, that which is incredibly beautiful. It's deeper than any kind of love that you can imagine. It's much deeper than any kind of, as I say, any kind of liking, any kind of normal love. It's very, very powerful. It's your deep, how do you call it? It's the deep myth of your life, if you like. And, when I was initiated into the particular Buddha or Bodhisattva I meditate on, it was because I was utterly fascinated by this figure. Utterly fascinated. And I'm still fascinated by this figure so many years later. It's because it's a symbol, because it's an image, you can't come to the end of what it is. With ideas, you always can come to the end of concepts and ideas. You can put them in your pocket. You've sort of mastered them. With images, with stories, with myths, you can't do that. They defy you. So it's very, very important to find in your Dharma life that which is beautiful, fascinating, wonderful. It's interesting, even in the Pali Canon you get stories. There's a particular story of a character named Vakali, who was a young man who lived in the great city of Shravasti. And he saw the Buddha. He saw the Buddha one day begging for his food. He saw him and he fell in love with him. He just thought the Buddha was so beautiful, so incredibly beautiful. And the Buddha was very handsome. And he had a poise and a bearing and a dignity and a mystery. And, his quality of mindfulness was so attractive. I mean, if you really meet a real person is very, very attractive. There's a kind of field around them of awareness and his love and his quality. And this young man, Vakali, I've got to be with this man all the time. So what did he do? He became a monk. Didn't want to be a monk, but that's how he could be near the Buddha. And he was ordained. They took him on. I don't quite know how he passed, but anyway, he did. And he spent the whole of a rainy season retreat just being around the Buddha, just sort of gazing at the Buddha. It must have been, fortunately the Buddha is very equanimous, but, it must have been a real, a lesser person would have found it a real drag, following him around. And it's interesting, though, because at the end of the retreat, the Buddha said to him, Vakali, go away. You go into retreat and you meditate. And there was no discussion. It wasn't like, well, can I talk about my feelings, about that? Can we do a reporting in about it? No, into retreat. He was even having visions of the Buddha, the beautiful Buddha, and even the vision was saying, stop looking at me and meditate. So there you are, you've got that confrontation. But, of course, he was hooked. He was hooked by the beauty of the Buddha, the fascinating quality of the Buddha. And this is so important in our Dharma life, and a very important tantric principle. In Indian tantric Buddhism, you've got the sort of legendary stories of the rise of tantric Buddhism are really wonderful. These are the stories of the Siddhas, the Mahasiddhas, the great sorcerers. And the stories are so interesting because what goes on is that the Siddhas are usually people who very often they're people with an obsession. And they're from all walks of life. This is one of the big features of Tantric Buddhism. They come from untouchable castes, they're kings, they're robbers, they're liars, they're thieves, they're musicians, they're courtesans, all these different people. It doesn't matter what they are. The Vajrayana helps them to connect. So there's, the famous story of a king. And a wandering Siddha comes in and starts sort of abusing him and saying, I'm happier than you, I'm freer than you, you know nothing. And the king's getting really annoyed and wants to chop his head off, but he's intrigued that this man should come in and they start talking. And he said, well, how can I be like you? I'm really attached to my jewellery and my wealth. I love jewels. So the Siddha said to him, this unnamed Siddha said, okay, that ring on your finger, I want you to look at that ring. I want you to meditate on that ring. I want you to concentrate on that ring. And of course, he's obsessed by this ring and he starts to look at it. And it starts to get vast. And he starts to be full of Buddhas. So it's very, very interesting. He takes that attachment, that craving for jewels, and turns it into a meditation. And the king, of course, becomes liberated. There's the veena player, the old Indian instrument, the veena. The veena player wants to live a spiritual life, but he's so attached to his music. So the Siddha says to him, it's okay, play your music, but listen for the unstruck sound. When you play your veena, I want you to hear the sound that is uncreated. What a teaching. You can imagine the absorption of the musician. Where's that sound that I haven't struck? Not made by any striking of any string, but which is there, the uncreated sound. All sorts of stories like this. A favourite one of mine is of this boy, this son, who's doted upon by his parents. They just keep feeding him. And he becomes so fat he can't get off his bed. He's the only son, and they just completely dote upon him. And they suddenly realise he's not going to be able to look after them in their old age. So they decide to just, hire some people to take him to the cremation ground on the edge of the village and just leave him there. So this poor, fat, hopeless, creature is taken to the cremation ground and is just sort of left there. Fortunately, there's a yogi, a siddha, who's there, and he says, well, what's happened? He said, well, my parents don't want me anymore because they've realised I'm not going to be able to support them in their old age, so they've just left me here. He said, but you've got to go and beg, otherwise you'll die. He said, well, I can't walk. He said, well, all right, can you meditate? And he said, well, as long as I don't have to get up and walk around, yeah, I probably could have a go at that. He said, all right, I'll get food for you, but you must meditate. You must practice. So he gives him, a teaching. Of course, because he's good at lying down and doing nothing, he can meditate quite well and gains enlightenment and so on and so forth. So these you get these stories of these people. People are connected with that which fascinates them. So that's another thing to explore in your groups. What fascinates you? What enables you to really concentrate on the Dharma? What's beautiful in the Dharma for you? So important to find that. So I've talked about where the Vajrayana or the Tantric Buddhism find the Buddha. They find it in the teacher. They find the Dharma in the deity. What about the Sangha, the spiritual community, the third of the three jewels? Where is that in our experience? Well, they say it's found in a figure called the Dakini. The Dakini. Very hard to understand what a Dakini is. A Dakini is a sort of, I suppose you could say, a sort of goddess type figure. Very, very beautiful, very attractive, very dangerous in some ways. The Dakini is the sort of, you could say, the spirit of inspiration and attraction that arises in very, very close spiritual friendship. And people get quite excited by Dakinis. They're very, usually very colourful figures, red and scantily clad and dancing. They're sort of, almost like sort of, tantric go-go dancers. But, and youthful and lovely and all the rest of it. People often get very excited by the Dakini. But the Dakini is not really like that. I'm going to tell you a story about a Dakini. And it's a story concerning a great tantric figure named Naropa. Naropa was a great scholar at the Nalanda University and great pandit. And one day he was studying the very arcane treatises of Mahayana Buddhism, all about Shunyata and one mind. And as he was sitting, a great shadow fell over his books. And he looked up to see this old, bent woman, a real crone, very dark, really ancient, with a sort of streaky beard and really lined and yellow eyes and kind of crooked teeth and really, really ugly, with warts and kind of licking her lips and, her breathing was sort of making whispering noises and, really, really sort of disgusting figure. And you have to understand, in India that an old woman like that, probably a widow and so on, would be regarded, and she's dark. That means she must be, sort of low. Naropa was from a Brahmin background, so you've got a whole thing going on here of, the unacceptable, coming into this highly intellectual, very sort of so-called pure world. And the old woman, the old crone, said to Naropa, "What are you looking into?" And he said, "Well, I'm reading all about logic and shunyata and one mind." And she said, Do you understand the words?" "Yes, I understand the words." And she started laughing, shaking us, almost dancing, this old lady, dancing and laughing. And then she said, "Do you understand the meaning?" And he said, "Yes, I understand the meaning." And then she started to weep uncontrollably weep. And he said, well, why did you laugh when I said I understood the words? And why do you weep when I say I understand the meaning? And she said, well, I laughed when you said you understood the words because you were telling the truth. But when you said you understood the meaning, you were lying. You don't understand the meaning. And that really upset me. This hit Naropa like a thunderbolt because it was true. He was highly intellectual, highly skilled, had a lot of status in the great monastery of Nalanda. But here was this illiterate old crone revealing that in effect he knew nothing. Nothing. So he said, well, who knows the meaning? And she said, my brother. And then vanished. And, well, the story goes on. I mean, there's an incredible song that Naropa sings after this, beginning with the famous line after this vision of this old lady. Samsara is the tendency to find fault with others. What an incredible insight from that. But the reason why I tell this story is that, like the Guru, the Sangha again will confront us with the reality of our lives. In the spiritual community, we start learning how to translate the words of the Dharma, the ideas of the Dharma, into the living experience of the Dharma. So it's very, very important. Vidanya was talking about how important the Sangha is and spiritual friendship is. And it's through that medium, that we learn how to live the Dharma fully. We learn, for a start, to start overcoming our differences. Because one of the things about spiritual community is that we all come from different backgrounds. We all come from different conditionings. One of the really irritating things about the Buddhist spiritual community is that you end up with people that you wouldn't usually choose to be with. You wouldn't, because you're united by something greater than yourselves. And that's a wonderful thing, because you've got to transcend your separation. You've got to find a deeper meaning. You've got to go beyond the words of the Dharma into the meaning of the Dharma, which is really the celebration of spiritual community. I'll say something about that in a moment, just before I conclude. I had an encounter with a Dakini. I think she was a Dakini. It was in India, and it was in a town called Manmad. Manmad is a railway town. So it was a town sort of that was built up as the railways were developed. It's a great junction town between the western and central railways, and the trains stopped there for a long time. And there's a lot of Buddhists in Manmad, and I was on a Dharma tour, and a big lecture was organised for me by all the different Buddhist groups and all the different political groups, Buddhist political groups. Massive, great program, very inspiring. And I talked a lot about spiritual community and a lot about harmony. I was told to by my friends, because they said there's a lot of factionalism in this town. So do give a strong talk about transcending differences. So I did that, and it was a very inspiring evening. The next morning, I was in, well, you could hardly call it a hotel. I don't know what you'd call it. It was a pretty sort of grim place, as you can imagine, in a railway town. And I was sitting on my bed having my morning tea with the person who was my interpreter. And this old lady came into the room. She was the cleaning lady, and she came in and was, that wonderful thing that Indian people do where they can squat right down, especially Indian women, and sweep while they're squatting. And she was mumbling in Marathi. And she was really emotional. And my interpreter was saying, go out with... And I said, no. She's telling us something. I want you to translate what she's saying. She wants to say something. It was this amazing teaching. She said, people should do what you said last night. I was there. people should do what you said. We should all be like that. We should love each other. We should stop having arguments with each other. We should stop being in division with one another. We need to love each other. We need to unite. We need to be together. We need to follow the Buddha. We need to follow Dr. Ambedkar, the great leader who brought them into Buddhism. These words were pouring out, and she was weeping with emotion. It was incredibly powerful hearing this. And my interpreter was quite an intellectual person, and even he was getting quite affected by what she was saying. And I was very affected. And what affected me was that this illiterate, very poor old lady was speaking wisdom, was in that moment the Sangha, the spiritual community. And I told my friend Lokamitra about this encounter, and he said, that's really strange, because when I was in Man-Mad, I met that same old lady, and she said the same thing. I think she's probably still there. I think I'm going to have to go back to India and see if she's still there. There's this eternal old lady who talks to us in this way. And what I want to say about that is that we need to open to wisdom anywhere and everywhere. This is another meaning of Dakini. Dakini is the sort of the wisdom principle. She's the Sangha principle, but she's also the wisdom, the lady of wisdom. And she can be anywhere and in anybody if you're open to it. Be open to anybody. Learn from anybody and any situation. Find that spiritual companionship anywhere. I want to end, though, by talking about, I said I wanted to say something about celebration. The Vajrayana has a particular vision of spiritual community. They call it the Gana, or the Kula. Sometimes they call it the Vajrakula, the no-nonsense community, a very, very tight-knit, close community where everybody is completely real with one another, even naked, spiritually naked with one another. But it's also called the Gana. I love this word, Gana. It's very hard to translate Gana. It's like the body of people. And the Gana is united around a particular teacher, a particular set of practices, and they have a particular way of coming together called the Gana Chakra, the circle of the Gana. And this is where they get together to do puja and to sing songs, and it's to celebrate the wonder of the Dharma life. This is one of the great things about the Vajrayana, about Tantric Buddhism. It's all here and now. It's all here and now. Reality is here and now, if you could but wake up to it. The great bliss is here and now, because the Dharma is here and now. And coming together, you celebrate. You don't have to do anything other than that. Celebrate the Dharma life and share it. Share it widely. The image of the Vajrayana, the Tantric practitioner, is, yes, of someone who communicates the Dharma, but not in a sort of worthy way, not in a kind of, oh, it's really important that you all hear this kind of way, but because there's nothing else to do. There's nothing else to do. It's the natural expression of the bliss and wonder of this life, of this Dharma life. I was asked a few months ago, I was in Berlin by a friend there, why should I be ordained? Why should I be a member of the order? Why are you a member of the order? I said, well, you have to realize that there's nothing else to do. It's the best possible life you could possibly live. I could have given all sorts of explanations, but that's why I live it. In a way, I couldn't tell you why. I just know that it is the best life. And that's what the Vajrayana is all about. That's what Tantric Buddhism is about. It's celebrating the wonder of this precious human life and the wonder of having the Buddha's teaching that you can live fully for the benefit of all. Okay, thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you